Usually, I like to make essays where we go beyond the text of the book and dive into the very human themes that power the story. But today, we are not doing that. We are making a listicle because it's the end of the year and it's time to review what we read. At this point, you'll see lots of Instagram posts and videos and TikToks where people discuss either all the books they've read in 2023, their top 10, their 4 or 5 star reads, or perhaps, if you're feeling a little salty, books they did not finish and would not recommend. We are going to be doing something similar. We are going to rate every book that I personally finished this year, but our rating system's a little different. We will be using the 2x2 behind me to discuss where every book falls on a spectrum of being well-read and unhinged. But first, welcome to Unhinged Well-Read. My name is Katie. I love to write, I love to read, and I've run a book club for over 4 years. This is a show about literature, art, and the human emotions that power it all. And today we will be talking about the books I completed in 2023. All right, so let's dive into this 2x2. On the x-axis, we have trashy and well-read. This is not a value judgment. This is more about cultural cachet. So well-read, we're thinking like highbrow books, things that might be a little pretentious. Perhaps they have fancy language or they would be considered an essential part of a canon for some type of literary genre, etc. And then we have trashy, and trashy can be really fun. That basically means beach ready, easy, fun, low-key, maybe a little lowbrow, but not necessarily. So that's the x-axis. On the y-axis, we have unhinged. So think chaos, entropy. You read the sequence of events and your jaw drops. That's what unhinged is. And then we have hinged, grounded in reality. Things flow logically. Anything in the real world typically falls in this category. And now, let's get into plotting the books. Starting with the first book I read this year, Severance by Ling Ma. This one's really popular, but if you haven't heard of it, I'll provide a very brief summary. This is a pandemic story written in 2018, but set in the early 2010s. It follows Candace, a young post-grad woman who works in the publishing industry, and her journey living through a pandemic. It starts with her working from the office as the world shuts down, and ends with her joining a band of survivalists and going on a journey to create a new life throughout all of the chaos. This book is wild because of its prescience. As many of us did, I worked through the pandemic. I remember what it feels like to clock in and get the green light going on Slack, even though the headlines are dreary and terrifying. So, for that prescience, and the fact that it is literally about death and pandemic times, we are putting it in the unhinged category. And yes, this book was a big book talk book. I'm a little late on the trend. But the content of the prose and the flow of the plot and the way that the character speaks, I really enjoy. So I would say it's kind of there on the well-read scale, maybe on the lower end. So we're going to give it that moderate rating of being unhinged and well-read. The second book I read this year is a Haruki Murakami book. And while you might be thinking, isn't he the one who says a lot of weird stuff about women in his writing? I would not know. I have only read this one book, and it is his memoir, What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. This is a book that follows Murakami as he trains to run a marathon. It discusses aging, especially how you hit your physical peak earlier, but he's still training and running even though his times are getting worse. It discusses finding the time and the discipline to run and exercise while being a very busy novelist. It also has a very tender description of Boston where it's partially set. I used to live there. It describes donkeys and Sam Adams, and that is the culture. Much like training for a marathon, this book has a very logical progression, so it's in the hinged category. But I'm going to put it midway through, well read. A lot of people read Murakami, but this is kind of a deep cut book, It's also unlike the other stuff that he's written. So we're going to put that right there. Now let's move on to the next book, Dictee by Theresa Kyung. This is a piece of experimental literature. It blends poetry, memoir, and historical fiction. This is a book that also spans languages. It includes Korean, French, and English. This was a super difficult read. It is often assigned in English classes for those who are exploring postmodernism, experimental forms of writing, or Asian American literature and art. I really struggled through this. I enjoyed it. It was an experience. I don't speak French, so I missed a lot of it. And I listened to a very helpful recording from the Whitney of people doing a reading out loud, so I could kind of experience the languages and the parts I could not understand with my very limited knowledge of one language. This has high academic clout, so it is going to be very far on the well-read spectrum. But it's also written in a way that is barely comprehensible at times, especially if you only speak English. So this is going very high on the Unhinged scale as well. So let's just scoot on over and put it up there in its rightful place. Up next, a polarizing book, My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. Short recap. This is basically about a woman who has lost both of her parents, and she takes a lot of drugs and tries to sleep for a full year. She is also a very bad friend and arguably a very bad person. This book reeks of privilege, and I really, really enjoyed it. I like Chuck Palahniuk. I like femcel type stuff. I understand why this has the cult following that it does. It is so intense in its portrayal of just this very white female depression that it borders on satire. And I really enjoy that. This was great. It also mentions performance art and art in general, which is something that really hits with me. It's set in New York, a city I've spent a lot of time in. Personally, I thought this was great. I understand why people say it feels like nothing happens in the book, because a lot of it is her sleeping. But the way that it's written is so sharp and biting, and I love that. And for the writing style, it is going both in Unhinged and well-read. I will concede and put it a little bit behind Severance on the well-read meter, but also higher on the Unhinged meter. If you like Fight Club and Chuck Palahniuk, but you wish there was more stuff for women, great choice of a book. Up next, we have the book Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. This is a very tender portrayal of a different variety of coming of age. It's about this woman in her 30s, and her life is really stagnant. She works at a convenience store. She's not married. She has a very low-key social life. She kind of mirrors other people's personalities and is just trying to do what society expects her to, where she's really happy being where she is and working at the convenience store. I thought this was a fun book, a very easy read, and it hits a lot of themes that Sayaka Murata covers in her book, like conformity and fitting into society. So I would put this on the Hinged spectrum because it is set in a real place, real type of environment. I've been to these convenience stores in Japan, and I'm going to put it in the slightly well-read category. I understand why this is a recommended book, and it's also a great way to get out of a reading slump. Up next, we have one of a couple Didion books. I'm a big Joan Didion girly. I am like one step away from smoking a cigarette and drinking a martini and being one of the people with the tote bag on the 7 train. But I live in California, and I don't actually do any of those things, except for carrying tote bags. But anyway, Blue Nights by Joan Didion. If you've read The Year of Magical Thinking, this is essentially a spiritual successor. The Year of Magical Thinking talks about the first year after Didion lost her husband. And this book talks about the emotions that she feels after having lost her daughter. This is also set many years after her daughter passed away. She lost both her husband and her daughter in very close succession. This does not speak as widely to the grieving experience as The Year of Magical Thinking. So don't go into reading this expecting it to be a part 2. But it is a very tender look on losing someone who you don't expect to die first, like a child. And it also covers topics like aging and watching your life continue after some of the most important people to you in your personal history have moved on and passed away. So this was sad, very realistic, so we're putting it in Unhinged, but as with anything Joan Didion, the prose is highbrow and I really liked it, so very realistic, pretty sad, very well read. All right, and now we are moving on to the first book I did not like, Undisclosed Wolf Book. For those of you who might have read it, here is a high-level summary. A woman moves from an area she was living to an area in the UK broadly and brings wolves back to that region as a form of rewilding. The wolves were the best part of the book, and the worst part of the book was the underlying mystery plot, the romantic pairings that I felt were unnecessary and did not enjoy, and surprise, a pregnancy, which also felt way too convenient. I think he nutted once and then boom, baby. Very weird. This had no literary merit in my opinion, so definitely trashy. And because of the plot elements that felt very hand of God and not well set up, I'm putting it in slightly unhinged, but like pretty bad. So all the way over there. Relegated where it belongs. All right, our next book is CQ, A Journey Through American Loneliness. I actually made a full-length podcast/video essay about this, which you can watch on this very channel or streaming platform, whatever you're consuming this content on. I really liked CQ. If you have not seen the video, it is a comic that covers loneliness in the US. It blends memoir, personal anecdotes, research, psychological studies. This was great. The art was wonderful. It's definitely like, in the well-read category because I thought it had a lot of merit. Also, I'm going to put art as a part of the reading spectrum, even though you're just kind of looking with your eyes and it's technically not reading, but whatever. And I'm going to put this in Hinged, pretty hinged, because it had a lot of data and stats backing it up. So it was very grounded in reality. Very solid piece of nonfiction work. And now we are moving on to Undisclosed Queer Sad Romance. If you've read this book, this is about two women who fall in love, but they don't spend very much time together in the book. And one of them doesn't know what she's doing with her life and ends up getting into contracting for houses and such, and the other works at a bar. This was very big on Book Talk, and I did not enjoy this, primarily because I want my romances to have the two people who are in love spend more than 10% of the book in the same vicinity. They did not interact very much at all. Also, both characters had a ton of trauma. Give me the happy, queer, women-loving women love stories and not the weird, everybody has trauma. Like, every character should have had 2 traumas taken away. It would have been a more human and realistic version of trauma if they each had 2 less traumas. So anyway, kind of trashy. It was trying really hard to be highbrow. Didn't hit for me. Very hinged, but almost too sad. Like, it's so sad and dramatic that it's unrealistic. So it's not at the bottom of Hinged. It's just under the line. I could see some people really enjoying this. I think I was just more in the mood for a happy love story than something that was super dramatic. All right, and that's it of the books I did not like. Everything from this point forward will have a name, which leads us to Political Fictions by Joan Didion. This is a collection of essays that talk about politics in America. And the main thesis is basically it's all about show and it is very removed from the average American's daily life. Like, the things that Washington cares about is just Washington talking about itself, and the body politic, the civilians, everybody in their normal lives does not take the same stance as a supposedly representative government takes in office. This is a very broad simplification. This was a challenging book. It requires you to have a fairly deep understanding of American history and politics. But if those are in your area of interest, I thought this was pretty good. It covers Reagan. It covers, I believe, both Bush administrations. And it is fairly observant. I also think you can take some of the concepts in this book and apply it to modern American politics. So if your thing is seeing how the news cycle and how our attitudes have shifted over time, this is a very good book for that. Super well read because it's confusing and it involves knowledge of history. Very hinged as well because it is a well-formed actual essay and stance. So it goes right there. Same quadrant as Blue Knights. Up next, we have Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. I read this book for the first time in high school, but I realized that my husband had never read this book. So I read it out loud to him over the course of several months, because it's like over 600 pages, and got to experience reading it in a non-academic context. And it is such a good book. This is probably one of my all-time favorite books. It talks about race in America. It is a story of a young man who goes from living in the post-war South at an all-black college to living in New York and becoming a political figurehead, losing his power, having to find his place in the movement, whatever that means. This story has so much conflict. It's got this really tense scene about boxing in a battle royale, which the story is most famous for, I would say. There's a lot of symbolism. You could spend hours unpacking this book, and you should, because it discusses so much about the history of race in America. This was excellent. It is very well read. It is very unhinged. Like, this is literally part of the American canon. So we are putting it in far on the well-read section, pretty high up on the unhinged section. Up next, we have another comic. I'm a big fan of that type of work. I really enjoy it. I like to see the stories that can be told with a visual element. So with that, we have It Won't Always Be Like This by Malaka Gharib. This is a graphic memoir. It tells the story of different summers Malaka spent in Egypt with her dad, as well as growing up and coming of age milestones that happened along with those trips. This was such a tender portrayal of youth, and with every summer she goes back to Egypt, you can see huge strides in her development. More and more of those awkward and challenging but important formative moments happening. This was great. It also discusses having a complicated family dynamic and the joys of a mixed family, you know, having half siblings, siblings that are full siblings, step parents, etc. This was great. Because it is a real story, it is fairly hinged, but I'll give it the well-read status as well. I really enjoyed this. Right next to Blue Knights by Joan Didion. Now we have another Didion book, surprise, surprise, Play As It Lays, one of her works of fiction. This is about a woman named Mariah. She is an actress. She is married to a man who works in Hollywood, and it talks about the dissolution of her marriage, her battles with depression, all of the sad, meaningless ennui of life. This is a bummer book. It is a sad girl read for sure, but I really enjoyed it. And it has all of the prose elements that Didion is known for, that very unique style, the realism. So definitely well read. But not a lot happens in terms of wild craziness. It's not like a Babylon type deal where a lot of stuff happens. So I'm going to put it right here in the well-read, but still hinged. Just below the line. That seems good to me. All right. Up next, another memoir, one that was huge last year, I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jennette McCurdy. This book was so worth the hype. It was very well written. I'm always wary of celebrity memoirs. Typically, I don't like them. This transcends that. It is so good. It is a very tender portrayal of growing up as a child star, dealing with an abusive parent, trigger warnings all over the place for discussions of mental health, eating disorders, alcoholism, etc. It really shows that no one should be a child star. It is very inhumane. It's got some wild stories of beloved children's television shows and makes you really think about the kids who are in that industry. It's real, but the things that happen and what she encounters and the very real pressures that her mom puts upon her at a very young age put it into unhinged territory solidly. And the writing on this is really good. McCurdy is a very talented author. So we're going to put it slightly higher on the well-read section. And it's like pretty unhinged, especially for a story that's real. Onward, we have another book, big on book talk, huge following, had a TV show this year. It's Daisy Jones and the Six. Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is the only book I've read by her. And it was fun. It was enjoyable. It was very beach ready. I thought it was very innovative how it was all told in the perspective of interviews. Also, I love music. I've read several books about different musical movements, and this felt a lot like them with the interest and the whimsy of a fictional band. Overall, this was a fun read. It was good if you like music or 70s culture. If you want something light and mostly fun, this is a really good choice. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more challenging, I would recommend turning your attention elsewhere. But overall, this was pretty fun. It is a little trashy. It's got some of the love triangle, trashy type stuff, which I actually find very fun. It speaks to me. So this is not pejorative, but it does fall on the trashy side of the spectrum. I'd also say it's like a little unhinged, so I'm going to put it in that category. It feels very realistic, but also the 70s were crazy and people were doing a ton of drugs and doing a lot of crazy stuff and sleeping with a lot of people. So unhinged a little bit, trashy a little bit. I did enjoy this though. Don't let its part in the chart fool you. Now, on to Animal Farm by George Orwell. Yes, I have somehow made it through my entire formal education without having been assigned Animal Farm. I enjoyed this. I thought it was good. For those of you who don't know, it is an allegory for the Bolshevik Revolution where everyone is an animal and the pigs are cops and like the sheep are sheeple, etc., etc. There are farmers. This was really a good read. It requires you to have historical context. I understand why it's read in school, where you have an instructor to kind of give you that background. This was fairly unhinged. Anything that's in the political allegory section typically is. It's also literally a part of what they teach in high school. George Orwell is one of the most famous English authors. The audiobook I listened to had a very fancy man with a very nice accent doing the reading. So we're putting this in the well-read section, and it's kind of middlesome, unhinged. Like, it's unhinged by virtue of having real people represented by animals, but beyond that, it's mostly just history. Up next, we have another graphic novel, Squire by Nadia Shammas and Sara Alfageeh. I probably pronounced that wrong. I am sorry. Squire is another political tale set in a fictional world where basically there are different races of people and one of them tries to move up the caste system by volunteering for the army and training with other soldiers. The art in this is really wonderful. I loved the back section of the book. It had all of this information about what inspired the story and then how everything was drawn. Like, it shows you what it looks like in flats and what it looks like once they add color. And it really makes you appreciate the process and all the love and thought that went into Squire. I typically don't like fantasy. And a big reason for that is the world building. Like, reading the world building is very tough. In a comic form, you can see the world. Like, you literally see what the characters look like. You see how they battle. You have a physical description of the different classes and people, and it's just so much easier to grasp. So it gets to the point of the story. It conveys all of the themes through art. It makes world building as a reader, creating the space in your mind, less arduous. I really enjoyed this. I also think it's a great intro point for graphic novels because the story is very cohesive and wraps up neatly in the span of the book. So Squire, I'm going to say it's well read. I liked it. I liked it a lot. I think it had a lot of merit as an art piece and as a story. I'm also going to say that it's pretty hinged. Even though it is a fantasy book, it is grounded in the real world in terms of its themes and its message. So right there. I'm trying to think of a quote from either this book or this movie, and for some reason I'm coming up short, even though I've watched it so many times. And the only thing I can think of is his name was Robert Paulson, and something very vague about a space monkey being shot into the universe or whatever. Because we are talking about Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. I loved the David Fincher version of this movie because I went to college in the mid-2010s, and being a film snob and loving David Fincher was very in. And this is a great intro point to his work. Just as this book is a great intro point into Chuck Palahniuk's writing. This is about an unnamed narrator who makes friends with this very unhinged man named Tyler, and they start an underground boxing ring where men fight each other for fun to feel manly. I feel like this book is really interesting because it's all about masculinity, right? It talks about being a man, what it means to be a man, feeling emasculated in the modern era, set in the 90s, and how that violence and rage comes out in different other, often societally destructive outlets. I think part of what makes this book really interesting is the author is a gay man, but he was in the closet when the book came out in the 90s. So if you're reading it today, you kind of get to put authorial intent in a new and different way that you could not have done when the text originally was published. And that's just very interesting. This is a great book. It is so wild and crazy. If you've seen the movie or if you've also read the book, you get it. You understand how chaotic this story is and all of the twists and the turns. If you've watched the movie, you don't necessarily need to read the book because they're so similar. Like, many lines from the book end up directly in the movie, but I really enjoyed this and I wish I had read it sooner. I'm going to give it kind of well read, right? This is a mainstream story, but it's pretty freaking unhinged. So enjoy that high spot, Chuck. You deserve it. Now, on to another essay collection, Bad Vibes Only by Nora McInerney. McInerney is a writer and host of the podcast Terrible Thanks for Asking. This is her third book. Her first two are more personal memoir type works where she discusses the loss of her husband to brain cancer right after losing her father and what it's like to move on after such terrible losses. I have not read these other two books. This is her most recent work. It's a collection of essays, and it covers themes like grief and loss and moving on, but also other topics like motherhood, putting your children online in the internet era, what it's like to age, seeing your body change, beauty standards. This is really so interesting because it covers such a wide range of topics, and beyond that, it's funny. If you've ever listened to Terrible Thanks for Asking, you'll see this art that McInerney does where she's talking to people about some of the worst things that have ever happened to them, but she's able to make jokes that are tasteful and funny and bring levity, but also don't undermine how dark these difficult things are. And this wonderful talent comes across in her writing. This is just such a human story. It's so good. I understand why it got the critical acclaim that it did. I'm going to put this in well read. I also love stories about women going through their 30s and 40s, so well read. It's also a little unhinged because her humor's a little unhinged. So she's just over the line, just over, because she makes a lot of poignant statements about the real world that we live in as well. I have no idea how long this is going to be. I feel like I've been talking forever. It's starting to get a little dark, so I turned on a lamp. But anyway, next book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo. I love to throw things away. I don't like owning things. They stress me out. The idea of both having items, storing them, and then eventually having to get rid of them causes me to have an existential crisis. Whenever I think about sustainability and how much stuff we all own, I want to throw up. So this book really spoke to my soul when she's like, get rid of it, don't own things, regift it, purge it, donate it. Yes, Marie, yes, let's get rid of everything. Let's not have objects. Anyway, main thesis. If it sparks joy, keep it. If not, throw it out. If you do keep it, be sure you store it properly. It is her whole method of doing that. If you've watched her reality TV show, you kind of get it. I listened to this on audiobook. It was a pretty good read. I'm going to say it's marginally well read, but it's incredibly hinged because it's all about organization, and it's going even lower than CQ. So that's where that book will live. Anyway, let's get back into the world of fiction with Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. I had seen this book recommended in a couple of places. I think I saw one of my friends reading it at some point in time, and it showed up at a used bookstore, and I was like, yep, $7 is good enough for me to go and expand my reach and read something that's probably a little lighter. I thought this was going to be a love story between a woman and her somewhat socially awkward IT friend from work. This was really a story about childhood trauma and alcoholism, and also socializing and kind of developing a relationship with the bumbling IT guy from work. This book was way different than I thought it was going to be, and much more unhinged than the fluffy story I thought I was getting myself into. It goes into quite a few dark places. So I'm going to put it in unhinged. I'm not going to say very much more so I don't spoil it. And I'm also going to say it was a little trashy, but it was fun and it was good. It's got it's right on the line. It's right on the line. It's going to overlap with the trashy well-read line. It's right in the middle. There we go. And now we are moving on with even more Didion. That's right. I love Joan Didion. I'm reading through all of her books, which is why she shows up so often. I did not group them together because these are the books that I read this year in the order in which I read them. Anyway, The White Album. Slashing Towards Bethlehem is the spiritual predecessor to this book. Slashing Towards Bethlehem talks about the feeling and the mood of the 1960s. The White Album talks about the end of this era. It covers both politics in California, women and the women's movement, and of course, much of the cultural happenings of the late 60s. She discusses things like the Black Panther Party and the Manson murders, which to her kind of marked the end of this cultural era. This was very good. It's more hinged than Slashing Towards Bethlehem, which was crazy. But it's also got that Joan Didion well-read thing, which I love. So we are putting it right here. Very close to play as it lays. Our next book is controversial, needlessly, because of fear and anti-queer, anti-trans rhetoric that is going around the world right now. It's Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe. If I pronounced their last name wrong, I am sorry. This is a graphic memoir about Maya's gender identity and realizing that they are not a man or a woman, they are a non-binary person, and sort of what it's like to discover that about yourself. This is such a meaningful and good memoir. If you don't understand what it means to be genderqueer or non-binary, this book is just a way to empathize with someone who's having this experience that you may not have experienced yourself. I am a cis woman, so I cannot speak to what it's like to identify with this book and really have it resonate with you, but people who are non-binary say that a lot. The art is also wonderful. The concepts are handled with such care. Well read. Hinged, because it goes through and explains things very logically and puts words to dysphoria. Our next book is a short story collection by Raphael Bob-Waksberg, the guy who brought us BoJack Horseman, my favorite show ever, Someone Who Will Love You in All Your Damaged Glory. This is a short story collection. Most of the stories deal with love, whether that's love between a person and their pet, two human beings, a brother and his sister, parents and kids, etc., etc. This book was so laugh out loud funny. It involves this world where it's like pagan religion, but also they have IKEA and like the absurdity of going through a marriage ceremony in a way that speaks to our world. As someone who has recently gotten married, it was in fact that chaotic. I laughed so hard. I felt things while reading this book. It was so good. And I'm going to give it very unhinged ratings because there's a story with a mutant president and it is awesome. And also like fairly well read. This book came out a while ago and it's slowly starting to gain traction again and appear in more bookstores, and it is so worth the read. So funny. Loved it. Now, let's change the mood and talk about depression. Or maybe stay on that same note depending on how much you like BoJack Horseman. This book is called I Want to Die, But I Want to Eat Tteokbokki. It is by the Korean author Alfageeh. It's a memoir about therapy. It talks about the author's struggle with depression, how she sought help and went to a therapist for the first time, what it felt like to unpack all of those emotions. I enjoyed this. The writing is fairly simple. If you've read books that have been translated into English, it has that translation vibe. I'm going to call it kind of well read. This has gotten some TikTok clout. Very hinged. It talks about human emotions in a way that's very real. Now, let's move to another memoir by a different Jennette. Jennette Walls with her book, The Glass Castle. People have raved about this book for years, and I have somehow never read it. And I finally did this year, and it was so good. It makes sense why it's always on the list of like must read, very tender, really great memoirs. This is the story of Jennette Walls growing up with parents who are very unstable. They move around a lot as kids. They are impoverished, hungry, etc. It talks about living in that environment, growing up, moving out, going to college, living in New York, being in spaces with people who have a lot of money, who say a lot of things about poverty, but haven't lived it, but being too ashamed to admit that you lived it yourself. This story is wild. It's also even more wild that a person lived through this variety of chaos. Unhinged for sure, especially for a real story. Well read also for sure. She is a masterful storyteller, and you feel like you're there. Anyway, we are hard pivoting with a cozy mystery. Arsenic and Adobo by Mia P. Manansala. Yeah, Filipino last names. I'm Filipino. Hopefully I didn't butcher that one too badly. Usually it's phonetic. Anyway, Arsenic and Adobo. This is a story about a woman who moves from Chicago back to her hometown to pitch in at her aunt's restaurant, and a murder happens. And the murder that happens is of her ex-boyfriend, and now she is being framed for it, and she has to solve the murder. We are pivoting because this book is trashy in the way that cozy mysteries often are. It is a beach read. It's very tropic. In some ways, it read as fan fiction-y, but I loved it. I also love stories that are written by other Filipino people. I find that inspiring. It's kind of unhinged because it has multiple murders, And I feel like most people don't experience one murder, let alone more than one. Very beach ready. We are back in comic land with another graphic memoir, Almost American Girl by Robin Ha. This tells the author's story of moving from Korea to the States as a tween. She didn't even know she was moving. She thought it was just a vacation, and her mom brought her to the States. And her experience making friends, discovering who she is, etc. after that big transition. I cannot conceptualize what it's like to immigrate and not even realize that you're immigrating. It is a wild story. It's so good, and it speaks a lot to the complexities of identity. Well read, yes. Unhinged, not so much. Let's keep it right there. We are moving on to another book by an Asian author. Another book, actually, by Sayaka Murata, Earthlings. I picked this up on one of my trips. I was traveling a lot to different weddings. I had ran out of things to read. This book was on sale. I saw it on Book Talk, and I liked Convenience Store Woman. So I was like, this will probably be a similar book and be something I'd enjoy. I did enjoy it. It was not a similar book. This book also talks about someone who is on the fringes of society, but in a way that is way more unhinged. I'm going to spoil it a little bit. There's a timestamp, but I'm also going to discuss some trigger warnings that you should probably know before you get into the book. This book had incest, like multiple units of incest. It had sexual assault. It had cannibalism. It had a murder. When I finished the book, my jaw dropped. I was on a mini-moon after getting married, reading just the craziest things. The main character thinks she's an alien living on Earth. And then a bunch of crazy stuff happens. And it is the most unhinged book I read this year. It's the most chaotic book. It surprised me at every turn. It was so short, but somehow included all of the things I just mentioned. Wild. It's pretty well written, but it's also super unhinged. Like, it breaks the charts. I don't even know if that's on screen anymore. That's how unhinged it is. Earthlings. This is another book from my tour of the East Coast during wedding season. It is Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. This book is an epic. It looks long, but the font's big. It jostles between different timelines, including present day America, Constantinople right before the empire fell, and the future, and a woman who is in like a spaceship traveling to a new world after the Earth has been poisoned. This has a nice mix of historical fiction and sci-fi. It also is one of those pieces that is just about the persistence of humanity, and it's a love letter to books. Not that unhinged. It's pretty much right on the line. Fairly well read. Right there. This is another book I picked up right after I finished Cloud Cuckoo Land. I read this on the flight home from that wedding trip, and it is Self-Care by Leigh Stein. This is a book about millennial women working at a startup, and it kind of tackles ideas of feminism in the modern era. This book was trashy. This book was kind of wild. It was like very much a satire. I wish I had read this a couple years ago when Instagram was really popping off. Now in the age of TikTok, it feels a little bit out of touch. But if you live through TikTok, or you're a millennial woman, or you've been at a startup and have had to grind, you may enjoy this book. It's pretty trashy. Maybe a little less trashy than Arsenic and Adobo. It's pretty unhinged because it talks about rich people and venture capital. And that's an unhinged world. So right there. This brings us to another book geared towards women. It is a TikTok read. It is Bunny by Mona Awad. I really liked this book. It is dark. It has magical realism elements. It's about this woman who's in a creative writing program, and she gets adopted by this group of very girly girls who are super into twee fashion and are just like weird and off and have cult vibes. I was always on my toes. I never knew what was happening next. It talks a lot about creativity and writing and toxic relationships between women. And do you love them or do you want to be them? I don't know. You'll have to read to find out. This was great. Personally, one of my favorite books I read this year. It was pretty unhinged. Less unhinged than Earthlings, for sure. Better written. Much more pretentious than Earthlings. I'm going to give it kind of that solid middle section. Maybe a little bit more unhinged than that, actually. Right next to one of my other favorite books from the year. All right, we are moving on to another book of internet fame and clout, House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski, or something. This book is a horror story. I picked it up because I had heard plenty of positive recommendations. This book kind of has a cult following. It is about a family that moves into a house that is ever expanding on the inside. Like, it defies physics. It pulls you in. It's got this dark aura and presence. This book is difficult because it's written like an academic paper. So it's got footnotes. You're flipping back and forth between the story and indices and appendices, etc. The book also has really interesting printing. Like, there are points where different colors are used, or things are upside down, or there's one word on a page, or everything's shaped in a square. It's very interesting. I enjoyed this. It was different than what I was expecting. This was not a cut and dry standard horror book. It is definitely unhinged, especially the print job. And I'm going to give it kind of well read. We are in the final 4, which is great, because I am looking forward to sorting through this footage and having a hot beverage to calm my vocal cords, because I feel like I've been talking for forever, but that is not going to stop me from raving about embroideries by, pronunciations. Marjane Satarapi. I am so sorry. Should have looked it up. It's too late now. We're already rolling. This is a very short graphic memoir. It's like you can read it in one sitting in less than an hour. And it talks about relationships and sex and the lives of Iranian women. And it was so funny and interesting and good and quick. I really enjoyed this. I don't have much to say beyond that. It's fairly straightforward. But if you come across this book, you should definitely read it. So, trashy? Yes. I feel like anything that's kind of smutty or talks about sex like that would be, well, trashy. But also, a little unhinged. It's right on the line. Very enjoyable graphic memoir. We are in our final 3 books, which includes our final Didion book of this video podcast, Salvador. This is an essay that describes Didion's 2-week stay in El Salvador during their civil war in the 80s. I'm actually going to not recommend this book. I enjoyed this. I know about the history of this time period, and I've read other books on it, so I'm going in with context. If you did not have the historical or political context, this book will mean nothing to you. And if you want to learn, this is actually not a good place to start. Not so well read. Like, I don't think this is necessary. But hinged, because it's talking about real life events. Now on to our final comic, Kokoro by Christine Mari. This is a collection of Mari's webtoons about her time living in Japan. She describes her experience as someone who is half white and half Japanese. She also recounts her struggle with depression and different mental health challenges, her relationships with her grandparents, and what it's like to live between cultures. This was a really fun book, and it makes me very eager for Mari's upcoming graphic memoir, which I believe comes out in 2024. It's very human, very realistic, hinged. I feel like this is a deep cut. Like, I found it for cheap at a used bookstore. So, it's just over the line. Now, onto our final book, one I just finished, Infinity Net by Yayoi Kusama. This book is really hard for me to categorize. On one hand, it is about art, which is very highbrow. On the other hand, I did find 2 literal typos, which you usually don't see so obviously in books, which is kind of trashy. The content of her work has a lot of sex, but also the sex is in the context of performance art. In all seriousness, Kusama's autobiography provides greater context for her art. She talks about her experiences with mental illness and how that drives her desire to create. You can really get a sense of how cutting edge Kusama's work was, especially for the 70s. And it's something that we take for granted today when we see her polka dotted work all over our Instagram feeds. I'm going to put it in well read because it's high culture and a little bit unhinged. And that's it. That's every book I read in 2023. I only have one book left on my TBR. It is Exhalation by Ted Chiang. I have not even opened it. I have not cracked the cover open, but I need to read it in like a week before my book club meets. So I'm gonna go and do that and also drink water and stop talking. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate it. Until next time, bye.